Clara Jennings was the kind of teacher everyone trusted, and Officer Daniel Price was the kind of cop everyone admired, until the morning their names became forever linked by a pool of blood in a quiet school parking lot. Maple Falls sat quietly in the middle of rolling green hills, the kind of small town where life moved slow and people still waved to each other from their front porches. The streets were lined with tall oak trees that turned a fiery gold every autumn, and every morning smelled faintly of coffee and cut grass. It was the sort of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, but for those who lived there, it felt safe and touched by the noise of the world beyond. The biggest excitement most years was the county fair or the high school's homecoming game. Trouble simply didn't happen here, or at least that's what everyone believed. That calm was shattered one chilly October morning. The first person to notice something was wrong was the school janitor, who arrived early to unlock the doors and found the police cruiser parked oddly across the spaces in the teacher's lot. The driver's door was open, the engine still humming softly, and the radio inside crackled with static. At first, he thought the officer might just be nearby, maybe checking the grounds, but when he called out and got no answer, a ripple of unease crept over him. The side mirror was cracked, the flashlight lay on the ground. Then he saw the dark smear near the car door and felt his stomach drop. By the time other staff began arriving, the parking lot was buzzing with confusion. The janitor had called 911, his voice trembling as he tried to explain what he'd found. Within minutes, more patrol cars rolled up, lights flashing blue and red against the school's brick walls. Officers swarmed the area, cordoning it off with bright yellow tape. Behind that tape lay Officer Daniel Price, unconscious but alive, his uniform stained and his body twisted awkwardly on the cold pavement. His radio was smashed, his badge bent, and most strangely, his body camera was missing. Word spread through Maple Falls like wildfire. The local diner, usually filled with quiet conversation and the clinking of coffee cups, turned into a storm of whispers. Nobody could understand how this had happened here, of all places. Officer Price wasn't just any cop. He was well-known, friendly, the kind who stopped to chat with shop owners and handed out stickers to kids at parades. Everyone liked him. The idea that someone would hurt him felt impossible. Yet there he was, being loaded into an ambulance, pale and barely conscious, as teachers and students looked on in stunned silence. The police worked fast, searching the area and questioning anyone who might have seen something. But there wasn't much to go on. No one had heard a struggle. The security cameras around the school weren't working, apparently due to a scheduled maintenance update. It seemed almost too coincidental. The chief of police called in detectives from the county, and by noon the school was officially closed for investigation. Helicopters hovered overhead, news vans lined the street. Maple Falls, for the first time in its quiet history, had become the center of something dark and strange. That evening, the town's mayor held a brief press conference outside City Hall. His voice shook slightly as he assured reporters that Officer Price was in stable condition at the county hospital and that authorities were doing everything they could to find whoever was responsible. But behind the polished words and serious tone, everyone could feel the unease growing. Parents kept their children close that night. Porch lights stayed on long after midnight. Something about the attack didn't add up, and deep down, people began to wonder if the truth would be something far more unsettling than they were ready to believe. Clara Jennings had lived in Maple Falls her entire life. She'd grown up walking those same sidewalks, waving to the same shopkeepers, and sitting on the same church pew every Sunday. Teaching at the town's high school wasn't just a job to her, it was part of her identity. For years, she had been the teacher everyone could count on, the one who stayed late to help struggling students, the one who decorated her classroom every season, the one who remembered every name long after graduation. Her students adored her, parents trusted her, and her colleagues saw her as the steady, dependable type. She was the kind of teacher who made people believe goodness still existed. But in the months leading up to the incident, something about Clara had changed. The smile that once came so easily seemed forced. Her cheerful classroom, once filled with colorful posters and historical maps, started to look bare and tired. She'd begun showing up later than usual and leaving without saying much to anyone. At first, her co-workers blamed exhaustion. Everyone at the school knew about her divorce the previous year, the long court battle, the financial strain. They spoke of her quietly in the break room, careful not to let pity sound like gossip. But there were other whispers to rumors that money was missing from the school's history department budget and that Clara's name had been mentioned in connection with it. No one wanted to believe that. Clara had always been honest, maybe even to a fault. Yet, as weeks passed, tension began to build around her. The principal stopped by her room more often. The tone of staff meetings shifted whenever she entered. Still, she kept her head down, focusing on her students, refusing to let the unease show. Her life outside school, however, was unraveling quietly. She'd sold her husband's car, taken extra tutoring work, and spent most evenings sitting alone at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of ungraded papers and unopened bills. Neighbors noticed the lights on late at night and sometimes heard her pacing the floor. She seemed to be fading, piece by piece. When Officer Daniel Price started making regular visits to the school in early September, it barely caused a stir. The district had announced new safety checks, and his presence felt routine at first. He was friendly, polite, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know the staff. But some teachers thought he lingered a little too long in Clara's classroom, asking questions that didn't sound like part of any inspection. Still, nobody thought much of it. Maple Falls wasn't the kind of place where people assumed bad intentions. As the weeks passed, the connection between Clara and Officer Price grew noticeable enough for others to comment quietly about it. He would show up during her free periods, and they'd talk behind closed doors. What they discussed, no one could say. Some thought they were just friends, maybe finding comfort in conversation. Others wondered if something more personal was happening. Whatever it was changing her. She became quieter, more withdrawn, her once steady hands trembling whenever she wrote on the board. She seemed frightened, though no one could explain why. By the time the attack happened, Clara had stopped attending staff lunches entirely. Her classroom blinds were always drawn, and she started taking long drives after work, her car seen parked near the edge of town by the old bridge. Nobody confronted her about the rumors or the strange visits. People in Maple Falls preferred to keep their questions to themselves. They told themselves that Clara just needed time, that she would bounce back eventually, that good people sometimes lose their way for a while. What they didn't realize was that something had already broken inside her, something she could no longer fix. When Officer Daniel Price woke in the hospital 2 days after the attack, confusion clouded his memory. The lights hurt his eyes, and every sound seemed distant. Doctors said he'd suffered a concussion, a broken wrist, and bruised ribs, but he was lucky to be alive. His first questions were about his body camera and his patrol car, but the answers were not what anyone expected. The camera was missing, his cruiser had been left running for hours, and no clear motive could be found. Investigators quickly realized this wasn't a random act of violence. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. Detectives from the county arrived that same afternoon, setting up an investigation room inside the small police station. They began piecing together the hours before the attack, tracing Officer Price's movements, reviewing dispatch logs, and interviewing everyone who had been at the school that morning. His last recorded call was routine, a simple security check at Maple Falls High. There was no distress signal, no sign of a struggle until his radio went silent. The only physical clue was a faint trail of blood leading away from the parking lot toward the back entrance of the school. It ended near a locked maintenance door. The school was searched from top to bottom. In one of the classrooms, the detectives found something unusual, a half-burned stack of student essays and exam papers scattered across a metal trash bin. The papers belonged to Clara Jennings. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but the discovery of a thin manila folder buried in her desk changed everything. The folder was labeled Disciplinary Review Jennings. Inside were letters and documents hinting at an internal investigation into misused school funds. The signature on one of the documents was Officer Price's. He'd been assigned to oversee a report about Clara weeks before the incident. The town's perception of both of them began to shift overnight. The story of the beloved teacher and the trusted officer now carried a darker undertone. Journalists picked up the rumors, spinning stories that painted Clara as unstable and Officer Price as her latest victim. Police visited her small house on Elm Street, but she wasn't there. The place was spotless, almost too clean, as if she'd prepared for someone to look through it. Drawers were empty, clothes were missing, and a single mug sat unwashed in the sink. Her car was gone, and neighbors said they hadn't seen her since the day before the attack. As days passed, more unsettling details emerged. The school's security footage from that morning was missing, every file erased from the system. The IT technician swore it had been working the day before. There were no fingerprints on the burned papers, no footprints in the lot besides Officer Price's and a few indistinct prints too smudged to trace. The missing body camera became the key to everything. Without it, no one could know exactly what had happened between the officer and the teacher during those missing minutes. Detectives widened the search beyond town lines. They checked nearby motels, bus stations, and rental car records, but Clara seemed to have vanished without a trace. Every lead turned cold. Meanwhile, Officer Price's memory returned in fragments, flashes of the school hallway, a shadow near the lockers, the sound of a locker door slamming shut. He remembered calling out a name, though he wasn't sure whose. He remembered fear. Within a week, Maple Falls no longer felt like the safe, peaceful place it had always been. Patrol cars drove slower, people double-locked their doors, and whispers followed every mention of Clara Jennings. What began as a single violent act was unfolding into something far more complicated, a story of secrets, power, and desperation that none of them had been prepared to face. The missing body camera was discovered 10 days after the attack, buried beneath a pile of garbage in a dumpster behind Miller's Diner on the edge of town. A cook taking out the trash noticed the cracked plastic casing and turned it over to the police. The footage inside was damaged, but technicians managed to recover most of it. Everyone involved in the investigation gathered in the dimly lit conference room at the station as the video began to play. For the first few minutes, there was nothing unusual, just the steady sound of Officer Price's breathing and the shuffle of his footsteps echoing down the quiet school hallways. His flashlight beams swung across lockers and bulletin boards as he moved deeper inside the building. The timestamp showed it was 6:47 a.m., long before students or teachers arrived. The hall was silent except for the low hum of the vending machine and the faint creak of a door closing somewhere in the distance. Price called out once, his voice steady but cautious. The camera picked up the sound of his radio crackling, followed by a faint thud. Then the light from his flashlight caught movement near the teacher's lounge. He pushed the door open, and the picture shifted abruptly. Papers were scattered across the floor, a chair overturned, and in the middle of the room stood Clara Jennings. She looked different from the calm, composed teacher everyone remembered. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide, and her hands shook as if she'd been caught in a storm. Around her were piles of torn documents, some half-burned, others shredded. The camera recorded her turning toward the officer, her face pale and hollow. For a few seconds she didn't move, then she stepped closer and something metallic flashed in her hand. It wasn't a weapon, but a small hard drive later found smashed near the school dumpster. What followed was chaos. The footage showed Officer Price reaching for her, perhaps to calm her or take the drive, but Clara jerked back. There was shouting, the sound of a crash, and then a sudden sharp noise as the camera hit the ground. For a few seconds, only muffled sounds could be heard: footsteps, a struggle, the scraping of furniture. The screen flickered, and just before the video cut out, Clara's voice came through clearly. Her tone was eerily calm when she said, "Now you'll know what they did to me." Then the feed went black. The room was silent when the playback ended. Investigators exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what the words meant. They reviewed her personnel file again and discovered something they deemed an internal memo from 3 months earlier. It revealed that Officer Price had been the one assigned to question Clara about the missing school funds. He had visited her several times outside of school hours under the pretext of helping her clear her name. But a few emails retrieved from the school's server hinted that his interest in her might not have been professional. There were vague promises about making things go away and warnings about what might happen if she didn't cooperate. The deeper they dug, the more complicated the story became. It appeared Clara had tried to report the situation, but her complaints never made it past the administrative office. The missing money, the erased footage, and the destroyed hard drive started to form a pattern, one that suggested a desperate attempt to hide something. Whether Clara was a victim pushed too far or someone seeking revenge was no longer clear. The evidence pointed both ways, leaving the town split between sympathy and suspicion. By the end of that week, the investigation had turned into something larger than anyone expected. People who once spoke fondly of Officer Price now whispered about the possibility of misconduct, while others defended him fiercely, calling Clara unstable. The truth was buried under layers of fear, shame, and secrets, and every person involved seemed to be protecting a version of it. For the first time, the quiet town of Maple Falls looked like a place capable of keeping terrible things hidden. 2 weeks after the footage surfaced, Clara Jennings's car was found abandoned deep within the Pine Ridge Forest, about 30 miles from Maple Falls. It was a small blue sedan, half covered by fallen leaves and branches, as though someone had tried to hide it. Inside, investigators found a torn jacket, an empty bottle of sleeping pills, and a burned notebook filled with half-legible handwriting. The last few pages were completely blackened, but one fragment remained clear enough to read, "They won't hear me. I have to make them listen." There were no footprints nearby, no signs of struggle, and no trace of Clara herself. The discovery left the town frozen between relief and dread. Some believed she had taken her own life, too exhausted to keep running. Others insisted she was still out there, hiding somewhere, waiting for the truth to come out. The police organized a search that lasted 5 days. Volunteers combed through the dense forest, guided by dogs and drones, but nothing surfaced. It was as if Clara had vanished into thin air. The longer she stayed missing, the more theories spread. Some said she had been meeting with a journalist who knew about the corruption inside the school district. Others thought she had staged everything, faking her disappearance to start a new life under a different name. The mystery fed on itself, and soon Maple Falls was divided into those who saw Clara as a criminal and those who saw her as a victim. Officer Daniel Price was discharged from the hospital around that same time, limping slightly but otherwise recovered. He avoided reporters and refused interviews, retreating from the public eye. His resignation from the force came quietly just a week later. Officially, it was due to medical reasons, but people whispered that guilt had driven him away. His name was still on the investigation reports, but his cooperation had stopped. Some said he'd been seen late at night sitting in his car outside the school, staring at the building as though he expected her to walk out at any moment. The school reopened, though it felt different. Teachers spoke in hushed tones, and students avoided the history classroom altogether. The walls were repainted, the furniture replaced, yet something about the air inside remained heavy. A few of the janitors swore they heard strange sounds after dark papers rustling, a locker slamming, the faint hum of a woman humming to herself. None of them stayed long in that wing after sunset. The administration pretended nothing had happened, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Months later, during the spring cleanup, a maintenance worker found a small rusted key wedged behind a radiator in Clara's old classroom. It didn't match any door in the building, and no one could figure out what it opened. The police took it into evidence but never announced any findings. Around the same time, a bouquet of lilies appeared on the steps of the school. No one saw who left them, but each year since then, the same flowers have returned on the same day, always fresh, always silent. Maple Falls eventually settled back into its quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet, now watchful, uneasy. The town that once prided itself on its safety learned how easily peace could fracture. The truth about what happened between Clara Jennings and Officer Daniel Price remained tangled in rumor and half-truths buried beneath official reports that never told the full story. And though years passed, the people of Maple Falls never forgot that October morning when the town's perfect calm cracked wide open, revealing something dark that had been hiding in plain sight all along.